Hello and welcome to A Question of Faith, brought to you by iCatholic. I'm Wendy Grace. Well, we're delighted to bring you this special episode of A Question of Faith from Rome, dedicated to the Synod on the Family, or to give it its full title, The Vocation and Mission of the Family in the Church and in the Contemporary World. With the help of an expert panel and contributions from some other key commentators and participants, we will give you an overview of the Synod and an analysis of some of the key issues and what the possible outcome, or indeed the legacy, of the Synod might be. The Synod process began a little over 2 years ago, and at this time Pope Francis gave instructions for a consultation process to take place in parishes all over the world. People were asked to respond to 46 questions on marriage and the family. This time last year, a smaller preparatory synod took place to identify the key issues that the full synod, which we're at now, would consider. Now, the synod is made up of 270 bishops from all over the world, along with many lay experts and invited guests. For the past 3 weeks, the participants at the synod, which included 17 married couples and 17 individuals, have been working in 13 small groups discussing the working document, in Latin called the Instrumentum Laboris. As we speak, 1,300 recommendations and amendments are being considered before the bishops vote on the final document, paragraph by paragraph. What is already clear is that Pope Francis had successfully changed the way in which a synod process takes place. There's been discussion, diversity and disagreement on the way. But this is a reflection of the honesty and transparency that Pope Francis called for at the start of this whole process. So let's hear how our panel and some other commentators view what has been described as a synod with a difference. Well, here we are just about a year later, once again in the Carol Wojtyła radio studio in Radio Vatican. It's fantastic to be here again. We're in the third week of the Synod and we're joined by a panel this evening to discuss some of the goings on in the Synod. I'm joined by Philippa Hitchin from Radio Vatican. I'm joined by Archbishop Eamon Martin, and I'm joined by Austen Ivereigh, papal biographer and founder of Catholic Voices. Thank you for joining us today. Well, first of all, a lot of people, even though we've been talking about it for a while, mightn't still understand exactly what is happening at the Synod on the Family. Austin, you might kind of break it down for us, simplify it.
Well, they can be forgiven for that because this is actually a very unusual synod. Synods have normally taken place in the church usually about 2 to 3 years, a gathering of bishops from around the world to look at an issue. This one is different because it's really a 2-year process, which began last year with the first synod and then ends this year with this one. So really a very complex process that's involved consultations of people. It's involved also other kinds of meetings in between. But the idea is that this synod is the one that produces the results, and it's designed really to set the pastoral strategy for the church in dealing with how to boost the marriage and family in the contemporary world.
And one of the things that's been happening for us this week is the small groups. Now, Archbishop, you were a moderator in one of these groups. Tell us a little bit about what was going on there and how that worked.
Yeah, well, first of all, I would agree entirely with what Austin said, that this is a synod with a difference. In my group, Cardinal Wuerl is there. He told me it was his 8th synod. But he said, this synod is not like any other. In fact, the hallmark of this synod, the driving force in this synod, has been the small group discussions. What basically happens is after every 2 days of plenary sessions, the bishops and the others, what they call the synod fathers, they break up into discussion groups by language. And there were 4 English-speaking small groups. Well, they're not small. In fact, there were, I think, 20 in my group, 20 of the actual synod fathers, plus another 7 lay auditors, experts and consultors. So the idea is that we would actually really get into the nitty-gritty of the discussion. The interventions upstairs, which are small speeches given by each of the bishops, are then followed up by more detailed discussion, paragraph by paragraph, of the working document, or the Instrumentum Laboris, as it has been called. Some bishops were calling it the Instrumentum Laborius because it probably wasn't a great document to start with, but that didn't really matter because it was really opening up the discussion on these big issues about the vocation and the mission of the family in the contemporary world and in the church.
It's an important question to ask, I think, and Philip, I might ask your thoughts on this, is what has been the role of women in the synod process?
Well, there's been a lot of discussion of that, particularly after last year, the first occasion in which these issues that are so particularly relevant to women were discussed. And there has been an attempt, even from last year, to move a greater number of women into the discussion. So we had married couples who were included amongst the experts, the auditors who were able to give their input, particularly in the small groups. Also, there was one woman, I believe, who was an expert, therefore helping the team that is drawing up the final document. But I think there's still a certain concern, if you like, amongst women's groups. In particular, I was at a conference just before the Synod began about Catholic women from different countries around the world who were saying precisely that. In an area where women, mothers, but also single women, grandparents, grandmothers, women who have such a key role to play in this question of family life, there isn't really, if you like, enough representation on these key issues that concern them so directly.
Austen, what would your thoughts on that be? Of course, with your involvement with Catholic Voices, probably you have a quite an even split in terms of laymen and women who are involved with this. But
I think it's wrong to look at this synod. It's not supposed to be representative of the Catholic world. I mean, this is a gathering of church leaders, of pastors, of bishops who are supposed to have come to this having listened to the people, and I think on the whole they have. I mean, we're dealing here with men who have a deep awareness, of course, of people's lives and particularly of family life, because that's the role of the pastor. So the idea is really for the church leaders to reflect together on their experience. This is very definitely a pastoral synod. Now, pastoral is one of those churchy words which can almost mean anything, but as I understand it, there's a distinction between, as it were, a gathering of people to decide on a teaching document. In other words, the result of it would be a document which clearly puts across church teaching and church doctrine, which is designed, as it were, to evangelize and to persuade. But this is different. This is I think I'm right saying a strategy document really is what is coming out of this process. And pastoral means how is it that the church can walk alongside the contemporary society, people in their contemporary struggles? How can the church best support that? So that's really why the Pope called it. Now, the context of this is, I think, two things. First of all, is the breakdown of support for marriage and family in the law and culture, particularly of the Western world. The massive collapse in the Western world has been a very, very striking feature. And secondly, Pope Francis's desire to put the church in a more missionary and pastoral direction, which, in other words, a direction which enables the church better to meet people where they are, come alongside them and support them.
Yes, and I think Austen has put his finger on it there, that this is indeed a pastoral synod. And in fact, I was just saying to someone yesterday, even though there are a few days still to go in the synod, the production of the final document and that, but as I was saying yesterday, if I was to go home today, I think I have already gained an immense amount from listening to the stories of these people from all over the world, their pastoral experiences as bishops, as teachers, as leaders in their diocese, and also just to hear the situations of families in other parts of the world, the kinds of challenges that they are going through in the same way as we are going through challenges in Ireland and England and elsewhere. And therefore, I think that as a pastoral initiative and as a pastoral experience, this has been second to none.
In that sense, Archbishop, are you talking about just the pastoral realities that you've heard about from other countries, that you would bring some of those ideas, for example, back to Ireland?
I hope so. I think I have loads in my head at the moment. How you would go about it, I think it really has to get down now to discussions in our episcopal conferences, in our commissions for marriage and the family, and then of course at diocesan level. And this is a beautiful illustration of what Pope Francis himself spoke about synodality last Saturday. He said it really begins from the ground up, or from the outside in, and then once more from the inside out, so that in some way pastoral experience is informing and shaping how we teach, and how we teach in turn then shapes the pastoral experience.
I mean, he used this expression, didn't he, synodal church, apparently for the first time. That hasn't been used before. And of course what he means by that is this process of listening, which has been going on in here, really needs to be replicated throughout the church. Of course it hasn't been, has it? I mean, that's one of the striking things about, in a way, the great consultation that was supposed to take place between these two synods, in a way hasn't. I mean, Cardinal Marx was indeed just saying that, when they first thought of this, that's what they imagined. In fact, lots of people have produced books and articles, haven't they, restating their positions, but I'm not sure how much at a diocesan level. I don't know whether in Ireland you've had, meetings and diocesan assemblies to discuss any of this.
Yeah, we had some very interesting discussions, but I would also admit we've been taking baby steps in synodality.
Well, we're not used to it, are we? We're not used
I
to
was
it.
particularly struck by one or two of the small groups when they were wrapping up their discussion of part 3, saying, well, we need to do a lot more research and hear a lot more from the experts. Well, my question is, the Pope made this announcement back in 2013.
What were you doing?
2 years is a long time to get that input that you wanted from the experts on the ground, and it obviously hasn't happened yet.
So we've seen how the whole synod process has worked, and very shortly we're going to join our panel again to analyse some of the key issues of this synod. But first, we chat to some people who've been attending the synod for the past 3 weeks and ask them the question that, has the reflection that the media has presented of this synod been the reality that they've experienced here on the ground?
It really depends who you ask. I mean, the way I've gotten it is the perception from a lot of people is, wow, the bishops are fighting, they're arguing, there's conservative, there's liberal, there's attacks on one another. And I think that's actually partially true.
Okay.
But then I also talk to the people inside, and some people go, oh yeah, that's what's happening. And other people inside go, that's not happening whatsoever. I don't know what you mean. So somebody is spinning me, and I don't know who exactly it is right now.
I think there's been a story told in the media which misrepresents the synod. It's been told that there's been suggestions that there's been a manipulation, that somehow the Pope has been involved in like a puppet master organising a predetermined outcome. I think this is false.
Well, I think that's going to happen anyway, because I think really to get a full understanding of what is happening at the synod, you have to be in the synod. Most people are outside the synod, and therefore they're commenting on what they don't have a full knowledge of, and it's difficult. It's difficult also for the journalists covering the synod, because they have to base their analysis on daily briefings which try and deliver what is an immense amount of work, of study, of reflection that is heard and listened to every single day in that synod hall, and it's not easy. So obviously there's going to be a difference in perception.
And so I think it's all true. I think for some persons, it looks like a fight, and for some people, it looks very peaceful. It all depends on where they're coming from.
Well, certainly, I think there's a huge difference. In fact, I had to actually go online and go into the news reports to follow the news story about the synod, which was entirely different to my experience on the ground. I think that it's only natural that the media will look for controversy, for confrontation. But I think we all responded very much to the call of Pope Francis on the second morning of the synod. He said, look, I don't want you to be, I'm paraphrasing, I don't want you to be getting into these controversial issues as if they were the only thing to talk about. He says, look, broaden your horizons, speak openly, and share your experiences. This is a 3-week long process, and everyone will have an opportunity to speak. And therefore, I do think that my experience on the ground in the synod has been one of listening, of learning, and sharing.
There's been a lot of interesting people participating in the groups. There's also been an ecumenical angle to the synod, hasn't there?
Yes, as always in the synod, there's a group of what are called fraternal delegates. They're representatives from the other Christian churches, the Protestant, the Orthodox communities, that are asked to come along and give, if you like, a presentation of the issues that are being discussed from their own perspective. And I think it's been particularly interesting on this occasion, as the Catholic Church, as we know, is struggling with this word synodality that we talked about. What does it mean to be a church which is perhaps a little bit less centralised than it has been in the past, an issue that it's been dealing with for the past 50 years since the Second Vatican Council, looking at that perhaps from some of the more Protestant perspectives and hearing about ways in which these family issues can be dealt with on perhaps a more local level. I think we're going to hear more of that even after the end of this synod.
Something that seems to have been a huge feature, certainly of the latest groups, is the idea of accompanying married couples both in their marriage preparation but also during their married lives. In those discussions, do you think that's something that perhaps the Church has fallen down on?
I think so, yeah. I think that perhaps not in every culture, because I was amazed to hear the stories from the Indian bishops in our group and from the Filipino representatives, who basically were sharing with us the network of family communities that they have, almost like little basic Christian communities, families of families which make up their parishes. And therefore it's very natural for them, for families to be accompanying one another. And that would click into place, particularly, say, when a couple's preparing for marriage, that there would be a whole system of family support for them. And that would also continue then in the initial years after marriage, which are of course quite difficult for many couples. And then supporting families, those families who just persevere through the ups and downs of every day. The need for fraternal, familial support. And here lies the big question of the Synod, the vocation and the mission of the family in the church. I've had to look every morning at the front of that Synod book, which says this Synod is about the vocation and the mission of the family in the world and in the church today. And therefore I do think that we have to learn from other cultures about how can families minister to families.
It's interesting, obviously you yourself earlier on highlighted the idea of vocation, and a lot of people, when they hear the word vocation, they think of a priest or a religious. They might not think of marriage as a vocation, and just as a vocation to the priesthood is really seen as countercultural, are we getting to a stage where the idea of Catholic marriage is also countercultural?
Well, I think it's one of the big themes of the Synod. I think it's fascinating to see how marriage preparation and support is coming through. The message of the Synod Fathers is consistently this: look, maybe 30, 40 years ago in many of our cultures, we could rely on the culture, on society, to supply more or less the meaning of marriage. It was passed on from generation to generation. Mothers told daughters, and you just can't rely on that anymore. In fact, we now live in cultures where, particularly in the West, marriage is seen as a temporary thing. We hope it lasts forever, but if it doesn't, well. So in that environment, the whole way in which we go about marriage has to be looked at again. So they're talking about a kind of catechumenate, big words, novitiate type, catechumenate type training for people going into marriage, so that they are able to fulfill actually what the Catholic understanding of marriage asks of couples, which is not just to hope that it lasts forever, but to have what the canons call a determination of the will. In other words, you have to kind of really understand. Now, I'm really interested by this. Obviously, I have to wait. We don't know what's in the final document. But if in that final document is a very clear commitment by the Synod Fathers to bolstering marriage preparation, that surely must mean moving towards a model where you don't just marry everybody who comes along and offer them a 3-hour pep talk, right? You will have to say, no, look, this is Catholic marriage. If you want the other thing, the marriage light that's available from civil registry or whatever, Catholic marriage is going to involve this. Now, necessarily, lots of people are going to say, sorry, that's a bit too much, Here's a question for you. Do you think, in your group and so, do you think they grasp that? Is that really the implication of this?
Very much. An archbishop from Nigeria in my group, he says, if we're preparing for the priesthood, we take 7 years.
Yeah.
He says, how is it that a couple can get married and prepare for Catholic and Catholic family life in a few sessions?
Right.
But, that's fine.
And Philippa, what have been the key issues for you then during the Synod?
Well, you mentioned that question of truth, and I think a lot of the secular press has been making a distinction, or at least a perceived distinction, between the church leaders who are focusing very heavily on the truth of the teachings of the church, the unchanging doctrine of the church, if you like, and and putting that against the bishops who would much rather focus a lot more on the need for a new way of accompanying people today, a way that is much more open to this year of mercy that we're about to begin, and really opening up to this idea of a greater compassion, a greater care, a greater way of meeting people where they are in their family trials and difficult situations. And I'm not sure how perhaps that would have played out in the smaller groups, but certainly when we were listening to the small groups being summarised at the end, that seemed to be one of the issues that was really on the table, was how to bring together these two quite diverging visions of where the church is going and its mission today.
Yeah, I think actually it would be fair to say that in the lead up to the Synod, and indeed during the Synod, one of the big questions is that if we are a church of mercy, does that actually mean that we have to in some way dilute our truths? If we are a church of mercy, well, what of justice? What of sin? In fact, some of the Synod Fathers would say that there's no mention of sin in this particular document and in this discussion. So these are the tensions that have been there throughout the Synod. And I think many people have contributed saying, well, look, they do not see a dichotomy. They do not see too much of a tension here. And that indeed, if we read the scriptures, particularly the Old Testament, even the idea of justice, that it was always a restorative justice about bringing somebody back within the community, bringing them within the fold again, not making them feel excluded. Many people have pointed to the ministry of Jesus himself, reaching out to sinners. He didn't come to call the righteous, but sinners. And therefore, I think that those tensions, I think as time went on, I certainly found within the Synod people coming away from the extremes and coming into what might be described as a rather uncomfortable space in the middle, and starting to talk about what happens when you bring your teaching out into the peripheries and out amongst the marginalised. You don't have to change your teaching, but you do have to change your attitude.
It's interesting, Archbishop, because you earlier today were talking about two things. You talked about listening and you talked about teaching as well. Is that perhaps part of the problem, that it's a perceived idea of a lack of mercy, not because of what the church teaches, but because people simply misunderstand what the teaching is in the first place, and perhaps a lot of the job that the church has to do is better explaining what it teaches and why?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is no natural contradiction, is there, between truth and mercy. But there is, I think, definitely an attitude, as the Archbishop was saying. I mean, in other words, what bothers you? What keeps you awake? What preoccupies you? Is it the person who's suffering in need of healing? Is it the person who's outside who you want to bring in, and so on? Or is it, as it were, protecting what you've got? In other words, we are talking here about a kind of a culture shift or an attitude shift within the church. Pope Francis has, from the beginning, made mercy the keynote of his pontificate. It was very interesting that Cardinal Vincent Nichols of Westminster was just saying in an interview that in seminary he doesn't remember mercy as being an attribute of God. He was never taught that mercy was whereas actually, for Francis, for Cardinal Casper, for if you like, this pontificate, mercy is the primary attribute of God. Who is God but the one who has a heart for the poor and the suffering? So the question is how the church can, in its actions and in its words, communicate the reality of God to people. Because Pope Francis is convinced that when people experience the mercy of God, whether through unconditional love, unconditional forgiveness, unconditional acceptance, then they experience God, and that's what converts them. So I think one way of seeing this synod is, how can the church open up new spaces for demonstrating, for allowing people to directly experience the mercy of God, because that is evangelization.
So there's been a lot of very interesting discussions. But really, the big question is, what is the outcome going to be in terms of the long-term impact of the Synod? Do you have particular hopes for what you'd like to see the impact being?
Okay, well, I think what Pope Francis has done here is a remarkable thing. He has put on the table the whole question of marriage and family across the world. He's brought the world's bishops together to discuss this in an incredibly open, transparent way. We're very familiar with what's gone on with the Synod. We may have got a distorted picture, through the media, but actually we've been very, very well briefed. I think it's been remarkable. And I think what's been opened up by this Synod will continue necessarily to be discussed. The Synod does not resolve very much. In and of itself, it can't. It's a listening exercise, and it hands over to the Pope at the end of it. It says, here, Holy Father, here's the fruit of our discussions. Now over to you. Now, the Catholic model is Peter ultimately decides. That's how it was resolved in the Acts of the Apostles and the Council of Jerusalem, right? There have been very strong disagreements in the Synod, and that's fine. I think that's great that all this has been real. It's been a real process. But ultimately, it is up to the Holy Father. It is up to the Pope to say, okay, I've listened to you now it's my role. Now, what he does, I think everybody is fascinated to know. Will he issue a magisterial teaching document? Will he issue a series of motu proprios, kind of executive orders, actually changing the Church's discipline on certain things? Or will there be a kind of an exhortation at the end of it and so on? Who knows? Maybe this process will carry on. I mean, I think it's been well said. The end of the Synod, was last weekend, but actually that wasn't the end of the Synod. In a way, it's just the beginning. Synodality is now, if you like, part of the Church.
Speaking of synodality, as a word that people mightn't be able to get their head around, one of the themes of the Synod, and perhaps an easier starting point than others, is this whole idea of language, accessible language. Is that a good starting point?
I think it's a very important point that a lot of the bishops have brought up. They're saying today we're talking to a generation of people who just simply don't have the vocabulary that we had perhaps when we were growing up 30, 40, 50 years ago, people who understand words like indissolubility. What does that mean? What kind of overtones does that have? The language that we use is very often seen by a lot of people today as very negative. Now, how do we maintain the teaching, the essence of the teaching that we're trying to put across, and yet speak in a language that isn't, as one Australian bishop keeps talking about, church speak? In other words, a language which just completely goes over people's heads without really introducing them to the concepts that are at the heart of it all. And so I think a lot of the bishops, particularly maybe in the Western countries, have been really emphasizing this need to try and rephrase, to restructure, to find a new grammar, if you like, to be able to talk about the truths of the family
But I'm
life.
not clear about, maybe you can help, I'm not clear about whether this is just changing the language that the church uses pastorally, or whether it's about changing the language of teaching documents. Because, I mean, terms like intrinsically disordered, I mean, that belongs to a teaching document, right?
Yeah, I think that I would have 4 hopes. I'm going to call for 4 things from the Synod, and many of them have been mentioned already. I think one of them is indeed a new articulation of the beauty and prophetic teaching of the family and marriage in our church. And who better to do that than Pope Francis? He's a master of a teaching language which speaks to people on the ground, speaks to people who are deeply committed to their marriage, which speaks to people in the peripheries. The second thing I would love to see come out of the Synod is an endorsement of the good practice that's already happening in many parts of the world, ideas for pastoral practice, for how families might minister to families, ideas for the mission of the family as an agent of evangelization in the world today. The third thing that I think has to come out of this Synod, I would love to see it, would be a reworking of the great Charter of Family Rights, which was in Familiaris Consortio. Because the world has moved on since 1982, was it, when Familiaris Consortio came out. The threats and the challenges to family today, which are worldwide, and we heard a lot of them out in the Synod, about exploitation, child trafficking, child slavery, prostitution. There's so many new awful things and terrible things happening in the world today that I think we should have a clear statement of the rights of the family in today's world as we see it. And then finally, an apostolate of prayer for the family and in the family to support all of what's happening. So for me, it's a new teaching document, or maybe not new teaching, but a new language of a teaching document, a statement of ideas for pastoral initiatives for the mission of the family, a charter of family rights, and an apostolate of prayer.
Any final thoughts before we have to wrap up?
I'd hate to try and follow that.
Well, on that note, we shall leave it there. Thank you so much to my panel this evening, Austen Ivereigh, Archbishop Eamon Martin and Philippa Hitchin. So there you have it. There's a lot of hope and fresh approaches that will come from this Synod, and many challenges that were highlighted will continue to be navigated, perhaps in other forms. This programme is being recorded just as voting is taking place, and when you watch it, events may well have moved on in regard to how Pope Francis has decided to respond to the final approved document from this Synod. We hope that this programme will have given you a snapshot at the end of the Synod on the family. One thing that has been made clear by many participants in the Synod is that this will not be the end of the discussions. It has been a great reminder to us all of the universality of the Catholic Church, and as one Synod father remarked, that the work may have finished, but the journey will continue. So thank you for joining us on this special episode of A Question of Faith, brought to you by iCatholic.